My brother excluded me from our father's final year. I was the only one in the will. The lawyer's voice was steady when he read the will, but my brother Ethan's face went from smug confidence to ash-white shock in the span of 3 seconds. I leave my entire estate, including the house at 2847 Riverside Drive, the investment portfolio managed by Fidelity, my 2019 Subaru Outback, and all personal belongings, to my younger son, Lucas Benjamin Crawford. The lawyer, Ronald Kimball, a man in his early 60s with wire-rimmed glasses and the careful diction of someone who'd read 1,000 wills, continued without looking up. To my elder son, Ethan Michael Crawford, I leave my collection of fishing lures from the garage as he expressed interest in them during his childhood. I felt my hands go numb. Ethan stood up so fast his chair fell backward, the crash echoing in the small conference room. His wife Ashley grabbed his arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his sleeve. The estate was worth $1.2 million, the house alone appraised at $680,000, and my brother had just been left 23 fishing lures in a tackle box. I'd been banned from seeing my father for the entire final year of his life, told I wasn't welcome at the hospital or the house, excluded from every family update and doctor's appointment. And somehow, I'd inherited everything. I'd been working as a project manager for a construction firm in Denver for 5 years when Dad was diagnosed with stage 4 pancreatic cancer in March of 2023. He was 71, retired from teaching high school math, living alone in the house where Ethan and I grew up after Mom died from a stroke 6 years earlier. Dad called me on a Thursday evening, his voice steady but tired, and told me the doctors gave him 6 to 18 months. I drove the 3 hours from Denver to Colorado Springs that weekend, brought groceries, helped him organize his medical records, sat with him while he processed the diagnosis. We'd always been close, closer than he was with Ethan, though I'd never thought much about it. I was the one who called every Sunday, who visited twice a month, who remembered his birthday and Father's Day without being reminded. Ethan lived 20 minutes from Dad, but visited maybe quarterly, always with an excuse about work or the kids or Ashley's schedule. During that first visit after the diagnosis, Dad seemed worried but realistic, talking about getting his affairs in order, about updating his will, about wanting to spend his remaining time with both his sons. The first warning sign came 2 weeks later when I called Dad's cell phone and Ethan answered. "Dad's resting," Ethan said, his tone clipped. "He doesn't need the stress of phone calls right now." I asked when would be a good time to visit, and Ethan told me he'd let me know, that Dad was doing chemo and the schedule was unpredictable. I told myself Ethan was just being protective, that he was closer geographically and naturally taking point on Dad's care. But something in his voice felt off, territorial in a way that made my stomach tighten. I texted Dad directly. "Hey, Ethan says you're resting. Call me when you're up for it. Love you." The message showed as delivered but never read. I tried calling again the next day and got Ethan's voice again. "Lucas, I said I'd let you know when it's a good time. Dad needs rest, not constant interruptions." Before I could respond, he hung up. I stared at my phone, feeling the first real flicker of concern. When had my brother started screening Dad's calls? I drove down to Colorado Springs the following Saturday without calling ahead, figuring I'd just show up and see Dad in person. When I pulled into the driveway at 2847 Riverside Drive, Ethan's black Ford F-150 was parked in front of the garage. I knocked on the front door, and Ethan answered, blocking the doorway with his body. He was bigger than me, 6'2" to my 5'11", broad-shouldered from years of construction work. "What are you doing here?" he asked, not moving. I tried to keep my voice calm. "I came to see Dad. I've been trying to call him for a week." Ethan crossed his arms. "He specifically asked me to tell you he needs space right now. The chemo is hitting him hard, and he can't deal with visitors." I felt my jaw tighten. "Ethan, I'm not a visitor. I'm his son. Let me see him." My brother's expression hardened. "He doesn't want to see you right now. You need to respect that." Before I could argue, he stepped back and closed the door. I stood on the porch for 5 minutes, debating whether to call the police, trying to figure out if this was real. Finally, I walked back to my car and sat there staring at the house where I'd grown up, where my bedroom window still looked out over the side yard, where Dad was inside somewhere and apparently didn't want to see me. I tried texting Dad again from the car. "I'm outside. Ethan says you don't want to see me. Is that true? Please just let me know you're okay." The message delivered but didn't show as read. I called and went straight to voicemail. I sat there for another 20 minutes before driving back to Denver, my mind spinning through possibilities. Maybe Dad really was too sick to see anyone. Maybe he'd told Ethan to limit visitors, and Ethan was just following instructions. Maybe I was overreacting to what was essentially my brother trying to help manage Dad's care during a terrible time. But the way Ethan had looked at me, the satisfaction in his voice when he said Dad didn't want to see me, that felt personal. That felt deliberate. Over the next month, I tried calling Dad's number 17 times. Ethan answered 13 of those calls, each time telling me Dad wasn't available, wasn't feeling well, didn't want to be disturbed. The other 4 times went to voicemail. I left messages asking Dad to please call me back, telling him I loved him, begging him to let me know he was okay. None of my Messages were returned. I tried calling the hospital where Dad was receiving treatment, but HIPAA meant they couldn't tell me anything without being on his approved list. I asked if I was on the list, and the receptionist said she couldn't confirm or deny that information. In early May, I decided to try a different approach. I contacted Dad's longtime friend Gerald Hoffman, who'd taught in the same school district for 30 years. Gerald's wife answered and told me Gerald was at a retirement community playing bingo, but she'd have him call me. Gerald called that evening, his voice warm and concerned. "Lucas, how are you holding up? Your dad mentioned you've been busy with work." That stopped me cold. "You've talked to Dad recently?" Gerald sounded confused. "Well, sure. I visit him every couple weeks. He's doing as well as can be expected with the chemo. Ethan's been taking good care of him." I felt something break loose in my chest. "When you visit, is Ethan always there?" Gerald paused. "Usually, yes. He's very protective of your father's schedule. Why?" I took a breath. "Gerald, I haven't been able to see Dad in 2 months. Ethan keeps telling me Dad doesn't want visitors, but it sounds like you're visiting. Is Dad actually saying he doesn't want to see me?" The silence on the other end stretched long enough that I thought the call had dropped. Finally, Gerald spoke carefully. "Lucas, your father has never mentioned not wanting to see you. In fact, he asks about you every time I visit. He assumes you're just busy with work and life in Denver." My hands started shaking. "Gerald, Ethan has been blocking my calls and refusing to let me in the house. He's telling me Dad doesn't want contact, but you're saying Dad thinks I'm just busy. Ethan is lying to both of us." Gerald's voice dropped. "That's a serious accusation, Lucas. Are you sure?" I wasn't sure of anything except that the math wasn't adding up. "Next time you visit Dad, can you mention that I've been trying to reach him? Don't make a big thing of it, just casually bring it up and see what he says." Gerald agreed, though I could hear the reluctance in his voice. He didn't want to be in the middle of family drama, but he was a decent man who'd known me since I was a kid. He called me back 3 days later after visiting Dad. "Lucas, I mentioned you during my visit today. Your father looked confused and said he wished you'd call more often. He said the last time he heard from you was in March right after the diagnosis. I told him you'd mentioned trying to reach him, and he said his phone has been acting up lately. He asked me to tell you to call his landline if his cell isn't working." Gerald gave me the landline number and I hung up, my mind reeling. Dad thought I'd abandoned him. Ethan had been intercepting my messages somehow, telling Dad I was too busy to visit, telling me Dad didn't want to see me. I tried the landline immediately, and it rang 6 times before going to an answering machine. I left a message explaining that I'd been trying to reach him for months, that I wanted to visit, that I loved him. I called the landline 4 more times that evening and got the machine each time. The next morning, a Saturday, I drove straight to Colorado Springs without telling anyone I was coming. This time, when I pulled up to the house, Ethan's truck wasn't there. I knocked on the front door and heard movement inside. Dad opened the door himself, thinner than I remembered, skin pale and drawn, wearing his old navy cardigan and flannel pajama pants. His face lit up when he saw me. "Lucas, what a wonderful surprise. Come in, come in." I hugged him carefully, feeling how fragile he'd become, and followed him into the living room. The house smelled like coffee and the lemon furniture polish Dad always used. He settled into his recliner, the same brown lazy boy he'd owned for 20 years, and gestured for me to sit on the couch. "I'm so glad you stopped by. I was starting to think you'd forgotten about your old man." I felt my throat tighten. "Dad, I've been calling and texting for 2 months. I've tried to visit multiple times. Ethan keeps telling me you don't want to see me." Dad's expression changed from happy to confused. "What are you talking about? I've been wondering why you haven't called. Ethan said you're slammed with work and don't have time to visit." My stomach dropped. "Dad, where's your cell phone?" He pointed to the kitchen counter. I walked over and picked up his iPhone. The screen cracked in one corner. I opened it and went to his messages. My text thread showed my last message from March, right after his diagnosis. All my subsequent texts were missing. I checked his call log and found nothing from my number. I looked at Dad sitting in his recliner watching me, his face pale and exhausted. "Dad, Ethan has been deleting my messages and blocking my calls. I've sent you probably 30 texts in the past 2 months. None of them are on your phone." Dad struggled to stand, anger flashing across his face. "That's impossible. Ethan wouldn't do that. He's been taking care of me, managing my appointments, helping with everything." I felt a surge of frustration. "Dad, I'm telling you, I've been trying to reach you. Ethan has been deliberately keeping us apart." Dad shook his head slowly. "Lucas, I don't know what's going on between you and your brother, but Ethan has been here every day helping me. He's the one driving me to chemo, organizing my medications, keeping the house running. Maybe there's been a miscommunication." I wanted to scream that this wasn't a miscommunication, that Ethan was actively sabotaging our relationship. But Dad looked so tired and frail that I couldn't bring myself to push harder. I stayed for 3 hours, making him lunch, catching up on his treatment, listening to him talk about how hard the chemo was. He told me Ethan had been managing all his medical appointments, talking to the doctors, handling the insurance paperwork. He said Ethan had suggested updating his will to make sure everything was organized in case the cancer moved faster than expected. My dad's voice was full of gratitude when he talked about Ethan's help, and I felt sick realizing how Ethan had positioned himself as the devoted son while making me look absent. When I left, I made Dad promise to call me directly on the landline if he needed anything. He walked me to the door, moving slowly, and hugged me. "It's good to see you, Lucas. Don't be a stranger." I drove back to Denver with my hands gripping the steering wheel tight enough to hurt, my mind racing through everything that had just happened. Ethan was isolating Dad, controlling his information, and positioning himself as the primary caregiver while cutting me out completely. Over the next few weeks, I called the landline multiple times. Sometimes Dad answered, and we'd talk for a few minutes before he'd get tired. Sometimes Ethan answered and told me Dad was sleeping or at a doctor's appointment. Sometimes it just rang and rang with no answer. I started documenting everything: the times I called, who answered, what was said. I drove down to visit twice more in June, and both times Ethan's truck was there. The first time, Ethan answered the door and said Dad was sleeping and couldn't be disturbed. The second time, Ethan said Dad had specifically asked him to tell me that he needed space and I should stop showing up unannounced. I asked to hear that directly from Dad, and Ethan said Dad was having a bad day and couldn't deal with family drama. I left my number with Ethan and asked him to have Dad call me when he was feeling better. The call never came. In July, I tried a new approach. I contacted Dad's primary care physician, Dr. Angela Reeves, who'd been his doctor for 15 years. The receptionist said Dr. Reeves couldn't discuss patient information without consent, but she could pass along a message. I left my contact information and asked Dr. Reeves to please let Dad know I was trying to reach him. Dr. Reeves called me back 3 days later. Her voice was professional but kind. "Mr. Crawford, I wanted to follow up on your message. I've been treating your father for several months now, and I have to say, I'm concerned about some things I've observed." My pulse quickened. "What kind of things?" Dr. Reeves chose her words carefully. "I can't discuss specifics without your father's consent, but I can tell you that Ethan has been accompanying your father to every appointment and has positioned himself as the primary point of contact. Your father mentioned you several times in our earlier appointments, but in recent visits, he's stopped bringing you up. When I asked about you last week, your father seemed confused and said he didn't hear from you much anymore. That struck me as odd because in March he talked about you visiting frequently." I felt a cold fury building in my chest. "Dr. Reeves, my brother, has been systematically blocking my access to my father. He's been deleting my messages, intercepting my calls, and lying to Dad about why I'm not visiting. I've been trying to see him for months." Dr. Reeves was quiet for a moment. "That's a very serious allegation, Mr. Crawford. Do you have evidence of this behavior?" I told her about the deleted texts, the blocked visits, Gerald's observations about Dad asking about me. Dr. Reeves listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "I can't intervene in family matters, but I can document my concerns in your father's file. If you believe your father is being isolated or manipulated, you might consider contacting Adult Protective Services or consulting with an attorney about guardianship." The word guardianship hit me like a punch. Was it really that serious? Was Ethan's behavior rising to the level of elder abuse? I thanked Dr. Reeves and hung up, then immediately started researching elder abuse in isolation. What I found made my blood run cold. Isolating an elderly person from family members, controlling their communications, and manipulating their perception of relationships were all recognized forms of financial and emotional abuse. Abusers often positioned themselves as devoted caregivers while cutting out potential witnesses to their manipulation. The goal was usually financial, controlling the victim's assets, influencing changes to wills or trusts, redirecting money or property. My brother was checking every box on the warning signs list. I called a law firm in Colorado Springs that specialized in elder law and made an appointment with attorney Melissa Vance, who had 23 years of experience in guardianship and conservatorship cases. The consultation was scheduled for the following week. I took a personal day from work and drove down early, my stomach churning with anxiety about what I was about to set in motion. Attorney Vance's office was in a professional building downtown, tastefully, decorated with law books and family photos. Melissa herself was in her early 50s, with gray-streaked hair pulled back in a bun and sharp, intelligent eyes that assessed me carefully when I walked in. I spent 90 minutes telling her everything: the blocked calls, deleted messages, refused visits, Dad's confusion about why I wasn't contacting him, Ethan positioning himself as sole caregiver, the suggestion that Dad update his will. Melissa took detailed notes, occasionally stopping me to ask clarifying questions about dates and specifics. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and tapped her pen against her notepad. "Mr. Crawford, what you're describing is consistent with a pattern of undue influence and possible financial exploitation. Your brother appears to be isolating your father and positioning himself to benefit from estate planning changes. However, pursuing a guardianship case is complicated, expensive, and emotionally draining. It will almost certainly destroy your relationship with your brother permanently." I looked at her directly. My relationship with my brother is already destroyed. He's stealing my father's final months from me and lying to Dad about why I'm absent. I don't care about the money or the house. I care about being able to see my father before he dies." Melissa nodded slowly. "That's good, because courts look very carefully at motivations in guardianship cases. If you pursue this, you'll need to demonstrate that you're acting in your father's best interest, not your own financial interest." She explained the process: filing a petition for guardianship, providing evidence of Ethan's undue influence, requesting an evaluation of Dad's capacity to make decisions, and ultimately asking the court to appoint me as guardian with the authority to make medical and financial decisions. The whole process could take 4 to 6 months, possibly longer if Ethan contested it. My father had been given 6 to 18 months to live in March. It was now late July. Even if we won, there might not be much time left. Melissa also warned me that guardianship cases often prompted the alleged abuser to accelerate their plans. If Ethan has been working on getting your father to change his will, he'll likely push to finalize those changes once he learns about the guardianship petition. You need to be prepared for that possibility. She recommended I try one more time to communicate with my father directly, document everything, and gather any evidence I could before filing the petition. She also suggested I contact the hospice organization that would likely be involved in Dad's care soon, as hospice workers were mandated reporters who'd be required to document and report any signs of abuse or exploitation. I left her office feeling both empowered and terrified about what I was about to unleash. I tried calling Dad's landline that evening and got Ethan. "Lucas, I've told you repeatedly that Dad needs rest. Stop harassing him." Kept my voice level. "Ethan, I've consulted with an attorney about your behavior. What you're doing is called undue influence, and it's illegal. If you don't give me access to Dad immediately, I'm filing for emergency guardianship." The silence on the other end lasted long enough that I thought he'd hung up. Then Ethan's voice came back cold and hard. "You're threatening legal action against me? I'm the one taking care of Dad while you sit in Denver pretending to give a damn. File whatever you want. Dad knows who's been there for him." He hung up. My hands were shaking. I'd just declared war on my brother, and I had no idea what he'd do in response. I called Melissa Vance the next morning and told her about the conversation. She said we should file the guardianship petition immediately, before Ethan could take any retaliatory action. I signed the papers that afternoon. The petition was filed in district court on Friday, August 4th, requesting an emergency hearing based on evidence of isolation and undue influence. A copy was served to Ethan by a process server on Monday, August 7th. I didn't hear from Ethan, but I got a call from Gerald 2 days later. Gerald's voice was tight with discomfort. "Lucas, I just got off the phone with your father. He's very upset. Ethan told him you filed legal papers trying to take control of his finances and medical decisions. Your father asked me if you were trying to declare him incompetent." My stomach sank. "Gerald, that's not what's happening. I filed for guardianship because Ethan has been blocking me from seeing Dad and manipulating him. I'm not trying to declare Dad incompetent. I'm trying to protect him from Ethan's control." Gerald sighed. "Lucas, I don't know what to believe anymore. Your father sounded hurt and angry on the phone. He said Ethan has been nothing but devoted, and you're punishing him for being a good son. He said if you really cared, you would have been visiting instead of filing lawsuits." I felt like I'd been punched. Ethan had gotten to Dad first, framed the guardianship petition as an attack, and positioned himself as the victim. "Gerald, I've been trying to visit for 5 months. Ethan blocks me at the door. He deletes my messages. He intercepts my calls. He's been lying to Dad about why I'm not there, and now he's lying about why I filed the guardianship petition." Gerald was quiet for a moment. "I believe you, Lucas. But your father believes Ethan, and right now, Ethan is the one with access." That was the crux of it. Ethan controlled the narrative because he controlled access. The emergency guardianship hearing was scheduled for August 23rd, 16 days after the petition was filed. I spent those 16 days gathering evidence, printouts of my text messages showing they were sent but never delivered, call logs showing dozens of attempts to reach Dad, Gerald's written statement about Dad asking about me and being told I was too busy, Dr. Reeves's documentation of concerns about isolation, photos of me standing outside Dad's house after being refused entry. Melissa Vance compiled everything into a binder with tabs and exhibits, the kind of thorough presentation that showed we were serious. Ethan hired an attorney, Donald Kruger, a family law specialist with a reputation for aggressive tactics. I knew this because Melissa received a letter from Kruger 3 days before the hearing, accusing me of elder abuse through legal harassment and demanding the petition be dismissed. The letter claimed I'd abandoned my father during his illness and was now trying to control his estate for financial gain. It made my blood boil, but Melissa said it was standard intimidation tactics. The hearing itself was held in a small courtroom with wood paneling and fluorescent lights that made everyone look slightly jaundiced. Judge Patricia Klein presided, a woman in her early 60s who'd been on the bench for 18 years according to the placard on her desk. I sat at a table with Melissa while Ethan and his attorney sat at the opposite table. I hadn't seen my brother in person since he'd shut the door in my face months ago, and seeing him now in a button-down shirt and slacks, playing the role of devoted son, made me want to throw something. The hearing lasted 3 hours. Melissa presented our evidence methodically: the blocked communications, the refused visits, Gerald's statement, Dr. Reeves's concerns, the pattern of isolation. She argued that Ethan had undue influence over Dad and was manipulating him for potential financial gain. Ethan's attorney presented their counter-argument. I'd been largely absent from Dad's life, visiting occasionally but not taking an active role in his care. Ethan had stepped up to manage Dad's medical appointments, medications, and daily needs. My sudden legal action was motivated by guilt and greed, not genuine concern. Ethan testified that Dad had never asked him to block my calls or visits, that Dad simply didn't want to see me because I'd hurt him by not being present during his illness. I testified about every attempt I'd made to visit, every blocked call, every deleted message. Melissa showed the judge my phone records proving I'd been calling and texting frequently. The judge asked tough questions. Why hadn't I involved Adult Protective Services earlier? Why had I waited 5 months to take legal action? Had I considered that Dad might genuinely not want to see me? I answered as honestly as I could. I'd wanted to believe it was a miscommunication at first. I'd tried to respect what I thought were Dad's wishes. I'd only realized the full extent of Ethan's manipulation after talking to Gerald and Dr. Reeves. Judge Qley took a 15-minute recess to review the evidence, and when she came back, her expression was carefully neutral. I'm denying the petition for emergency guardianship at this time. The evidence presented shows concerning behavior, but it's not sufficient to override Mr. Crawford Sr.'s current ability to make his own decisions. However, I'm ordering a full cognitive evaluation to be completed within 30 days, and I'm issuing an order that both sons are to have equal access to their father. Mr. Ethan Crawford, you are specifically prohibited from interfering with your brother's attempts to visit or communicate with your father. If Lucas Crawford provides evidence of continued interference, this court will revisit the guardianship question immediately. It wasn't the outcome I'd wanted, but the access order was something. Ethan's face was red as we left the courtroom. In the hallway, he cornered me while our lawyers were talking. You just humiliated Dad in front of a judge, he hissed. He's dying and you dragged him into court proceedings. I hope you're proud of yourself. I stepped closer, keeping my voice low. You stole 5 months of his life from me, Ethan. You lied to him, and you lied to me, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you did. Ethan's jaw clenched. Good luck getting past the front door. Dad's furious with you. He walked away before I could respond. I called Dad's landline that evening and got the answering machine. I called again the next morning and the morning after that. On the 4th day, Dad answered. His voice was cold in a way I'd never heard before. Lucas. I took a breath. Dad, I know you're angry about the court hearing. I need you to understand why I did it. Ethan has been blocking me from seeing you. He's been lying to you about why I haven't visited. I filed the guardianship petition because it was the only way to get past him. Dad's voice didn't warm. Lucas, Ethan told me you'd say something like that. He said you'd try to turn me against him because you're jealous of how close we've become. I don't know what game you're playing, but I'm tired and sick and I don't have the energy for family drama. Ethan has been here every single day. Where have you been? The words felt like a physical blow. Dad, I've been trying to see you. I've called dozens of times. I've driven down from Denver. Ethan blocked me at the door. He deleted my messages from your phone. Please, you have to believe me. Dad was quiet for a long moment. I don't know what to believe anymore, Lucas. All I know is Ethan is here and you're not. He hung up. I sat on my couch staring at my phone, feeling like I'd lost something fundamental and irretrievable. Even with the judge's access order, even with evidence of Ethan's manipulation, Dad believed Ethan's version of reality. My brother had won. Over the next few weeks, I tried calling 3 more times. Twice I got the answering machine, and once Ethan answered and said Dad didn't want to talk to me. I reminded him about the court order, and Ethan laughed. Take me back to court then. Dad will testify that he doesn't want to see you, and you'll look even more pathetic than you already do. I contacted Melissa Vance about enforcement, but she said, without Dad's cooperation, the court order was essentially unenforceable. If Dad said he didn't want to see me, the judge couldn't force him. I was stuck. In late September, Gerald called to tell me Dad had been moved to hospice care. The cancer had progressed faster than expected, and the doctors estimated he had weeks, not months. Gerald gave me the name of the hospice facility, Mountain View Hospice Care, a well-regarded center on the south side of Colorado Springs. I drove down immediately and walked into the facility at 2:30 on a Friday afternoon. The receptionist, a kind-faced woman named Dorothy, asked who I was visiting. Raymond Crawford, I'm his son Lucas. Dorothy typed on her computer, and her expression shifted slightly. I'm sorry, Mr. Crawford, but there's a note on your father's file that you're not approved for visits. My stomach dropped. What do you mean I'm not approved? I'm his son. Dorothy looked uncomfortable. According to our records, your father has specified that only Ethan Crawford and approved medical staff are permitted access. I can't override that without Mr. Crawford's direct authorization. I felt rage building in my chest. My brother put that restriction in place. There's a court order saying I'm supposed to have equal access. Dorothy's expression softened. Sir, I understand this is difficult, but unless you have documentation of that court order, I can't allow you past the reception area. Hospice patients have the right to control their visitor list, and your father has made his wishes clear. I wanted to scream that those weren't Dad's wishes, those were Ethan's manipulations, but I could see it wouldn't matter. I drove back to Denver in a fog of grief and anger, feeling like I was watching my father die from behind a glass wall I couldn't break through. I contacted Melissa Vance again, and she said we could file for another emergency hearing to enforce the access order, but it would take at least a week to get on, the judge's calendar. Dad might not have a week. She also said that if Dad had specified the visitor restrictions while in hospice care, the court would be very reluctant to override his stated wishes, even if those wishes had been influenced by Ethan. People have the right to refuse to see family members, even at the end of life, Melissa said gently. Unless we can prove Dad is not competent to make that decision, the court will respect his autonomy. The cognitive evaluation Judge Qley had ordered had been completed by a court-appointed psychologist, Dr. Timothy Grant. The report concluded that while Dad was terminally ill and experiencing some confusion related to medication and disease progression, he still had sufficient capacity to make decisions about his own care and relationships. That evaluation now worked against me. If Dad said he didn't want to see me, the court would respect that decision because he'd been deemed competent. I tried one more time to visit the hospice facility on October 12th. This time, the receptionist recognized me and called security before I could even ask to see Dad. A security guard, a heavy-set man in his 50s, escorted me to the parking lot and told me I wasn't permitted on the property. If you return, sir, we'll be forced to call the police. I sat in my car in the parking lot and called Dad's hospice room directly. A nurse answered. I explained who I was and asked if I could please speak to my father. The nurse said she'd check and came back 2 minutes later. I'm sorry, your father says he doesn't want to speak with you right now. I asked if Ethan was in the room and the nurse confirmed he was. Can you please tell my father that I love him and I'm sorry for whatever Ethan has told him I did? Can you tell him I've been trying to see him for 8 months? The nurse's voice was sympathetic but firm. I'll pass that along, but I can't force him to take your call. She hung up. 3 days later, on October 15th at 6:42 in the morning, I got a call from Mountain View Hospice. The nurse on the line, Susan Qley, informed me that my father had passed away peacefully at 5:15 a.m. with Ethan by his side. I sat on the edge of my bed, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something fundamental break inside me. My father had died believing I'd abandoned him, and I'd never gotten the chance to say goodbye. Susan said arrangements were being made through Evergreen Funeral Home, and Ethan would be in touch about the service. She offered her condolences in a professional, practiced voice, and I thanked her automatically before hanging up. Ethan didn't call about the funeral arrangements. I found out the date and time through Gerald, who'd seen the obituary in the Colorado Springs Gazette. The service was scheduled for October 20th at Mountain View Presbyterian Church, where Dad had attended sporadically over the years. I drove down for the funeral wearing my only suit, a charcoal gray one I'd bought for job interviews 5 years ago. The church was half full with Dad's former colleagues from the school district, neighbors, some distant relatives I barely recognized. Ethan stood near the front greeting people, playing the grieving son perfectly in a black suit that looked expensive. His wife Ashley stood next to him, her hand on his arm, tissues clutched in her other hand. When I walked down the aisle, several heads turned. Ethan saw me and his expression hardened, but he didn't acknowledge me. I sat in the back row alone, feeling like an intruder at my own father's funeral. The service was standard, a pastor who'd clearly never known Dad very well, reading generic platitudes about faith and loss, a slideshow of photos showing Dad as a young teacher, with Mom before she died, with Ethan and me as kids. I noticed most of the recent photos showed Ethan with Dad, almost none showed me. During the eulogy, Ethan stood at the podium and talked about being privileged to care for Dad during his final year, about the deep conversations they'd had, about Dad's courage facing death. He never mentioned me once. After the service, at the reception in the church basement, Gerald approached me carefully. "Lucas, I'm so sorry. Your father loved you very much, even if things got complicated at the end." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. Gerald hesitated, then added, "For what it's worth, I think your father knew something wasn't right. In one of my last visits, he seemed confused about why you hadn't called. He kept saying he thought you would have called by now. It was like part of him couldn't reconcile what Ethan was telling him with what he knew about you." That small observation felt like both a comfort and a knife wound. Dad had known, on some level, but hadn't been able to break through Ethan's narrative. I left the reception early, unable to stomach watching Ethan accept condolences and play the devoted son. I drove back to Denver and spent the next week in a fog, going through the motions at work, barely sleeping, trying to process the grief of losing my father combined with the anger of how Ethan had stolen those final months. Then, 2 weeks after the funeral, I got a call from Ronald Kimball, the estate attorney Dad had used for years. Kimball's voice was professional and calm. "Mr. Crawford, I'm calling to inform you that your father's will is being probated. There will be a reading for the beneficiaries on November 7th at 2 p.m. at my office. Your presence is requested." I felt my chest tighten. Mr. Kimball, I need to be clear about something. I don't care about inheritance. Whatever Dad left, Ethan can have it. I just want you to know that my brother manipulated Dad during his final year, and I was excluded from his life against my will. Kimball was quiet for a moment. Mr. Crawford, I strongly advise you to attend the reading. There are matters you need to hear directly. Something in his tone made me pay attention. I agreed to be there. The week leading up to the will reading felt like waiting for a bomb to detonate. I couldn't imagine what Kimball wanted me to hear. Maybe Dad had left me a token amount, and Kimball felt obligated to deliver that news in person. Maybe there was a letter explaining why he'd believed Ethan's lies. Maybe it was just protocol. On November 7th, I drove to Colorado Springs and arrived at Kimball's office at 1:45 p.m. The office was in a professional building downtown, tastefully decorated in dark wood and leather. Ethan and Ashley were already in the conference room when I arrived, Ethan looking confident and Ashley checking her phone. Ethan glanced up when I walked in, his expression dismissive. I'm surprised you bothered to show up. It's not like you bothered to show up for Dad when he was alive. I took a seat across the table and didn't respond. Kimball entered at exactly 2 p.m., carrying a leather folder and a sealed envelope. He sat at the head of the table and opened the folder with practiced efficiency. Thank you both for coming. I'll read the relevant portions of Raymond Crawford's last will and testament, which was updated on June 14, 2023, and witnessed by myself and my paralegal, Sandra Liu. Mr. Crawford was of sound mind when he made these decisions, and I have documentation confirming his capacity at the time of signing. Kimball pulled out the document and began reading. That's when he got to the part about my inheritance, and Ethan's face went white. The room seemed to tilt. I heard Kimball continue reading. To my elder son, Ethan, I leave my fishing lures, as he expressed interest in them as a child. To my younger son, Lucas, I leave everything else. Ethan's chair fell backward as he stood. That's impossible. Dad wouldn't do that. We were close. I took care of him. This will is forged or he was manipulated. Kimball's voice remained steady. Mr. Crawford, I assure you this will is legitimate. It was executed in June, several months after your father's diagnosis, when he was still very much capable of making his own decisions. In fact, he was quite specific about his reasoning. Ethan's face flushed red. This is Lucas's doing. He manipulated Dad with that guardianship case and convinced him to change the will. Kimball pulled out another document. Actually, your father updated his will before any guardianship proceedings were filed. The date of execution was June 14th. The guardianship petition wasn't filed until August 4th. The timeline doesn't support your accusation. Ethan looked at his attorney, or rather, where an attorney would be if he'd thought to bring one. He'd come to the reading expecting to inherit everything, confident in his role as the devoted son. Ashley grabbed his arm. Ethan, sit down. Let the lawyer finish. Ethan slowly picked up his chair and sat, his hands gripping the armrests. Kimball continued. Your father also left instructions for me to provide Lucas with a sealed letter to be opened after the will reading. Additionally, he left specific documentation explaining his decision-making process. Kimball slid the sealed envelope across the table to me. My hands shook as I picked it up. The envelope had "For Lucas" written in Dad's handwriting. I broke the seal and pulled out 3 pages of lined notebook paper dated June 12, 2023. Dad's handwriting filled the pages, shakier than I remembered, but clearly his. Dear Lucas, the letter began. If you're reading this, I'm gone, and I hope you can forgive me for what I'm about to explain. By now, you know I left everything to you, and almost nothing to Ethan. I need you to understand why. When I was first diagnosed in March, both you and Ethan stepped up to help. You were calling regularly, visiting, bringing groceries. Ethan was managing appointments and medications. I was grateful to both my sons. Then in late April, things changed. You stopped calling, you stopped visiting. When I asked Ethan about it, he said you were busy with work and life in Denver. I was hurt, but I understood. People get busy. But something felt wrong. In early May, Gerald mentioned during a visit that you'd asked him about me, that you were concerned about how I was doing. When I said I hadn't heard from you, Gerald looked confused. He said you'd told him you were trying to reach me. That's when I started paying attention. I felt tears building as I read. Dad had known something was wrong. The letter continued. I checked my phone and realized some of my text message threads seemed incomplete. I asked Ethan about it, and he said my phone was acting up, that I should let him manage it for me. That's when I understood. Ethan was controlling my communications. I tested this theory by asking Gerald to tell you to call my landline. You called within hours. When I asked Ethan why you'd called the landline instead of my cell, he looked caught off guard. I didn't confront Ethan directly because I was sick and tired and didn't have the energy for family conflict. But I started keeping notes. Every time you called the landline, I'd note it. Every time you tried to visit and Ethan turned you away, I'd write it down. I couldn't always stop him, but I could document it. I overheard him on the phone with you once in June, telling you Dad didn't want to see you. I was sitting in my recliner 10 feet away. I did want to see you. I wanted to see you desperately, but I was too weak to fight Ethan in that moment. and he was managing my medications and care. I felt trapped. I read through tears now, my throat tight. In mid-June, Ethan suggested we update my will to make sure everything was organized. He took me to see Ronald Kimball, who'd handled my legal matters for years. Ethan assumed I'd leave everything equally to both of you, or possibly give him more since he was the one taking care of me, as he kept saying. But when Ronald and I were alone in his office, I told him everything. I told him about the blocked calls, the refused visits, the manipulation. I told him I wanted to leave everything to you because you were the son who'd tried to be there and been prevented. Ethan was the son who'd stolen my last months with you for his own gain. Ronald tried to talk me out of such a dramatic split, but I was firm. I wanted Ethan to know that I saw what he'd done. I wanted him to understand that manipulation has consequences. I left him the fishing lures because he'd mentioned them once as a kid, and I wanted him to remember that I remembered small, genuine moments from his childhood before he became someone I barely recognized. Lucas, I'm sorry I wasn't strong enough to fight Ethan's control while I was alive. I'm sorry you were kept from me at the end. I'm sorry I died believing you'd see through it eventually, but hurt that you didn't try harder, even though I know now you tried as hard as you could. The guardianship case you filed opened my eyes completely. Ethan told me you were trying to control me, but I understood you were trying to save me from him. By then, I was too sick to testify on your behalf, but I made sure Ronald documented everything. You deserved better from me, and I failed you. I hope this inheritance makes up for some of that failure. I love you, son. I always did. I always will. Take care of yourself. Dad. I set the letter down with shaking hands. Across the table, Ethan had gone completely still. Kimball spoke into the silence. Your father wanted me to ensure Lucas understood his decision was deliberate and based on clear observation of both sons' behavior. He also left documentation of his communications with Lucas and notes about Ethan's interference. This documentation is now part of the probate file. Ethan's voice came out strangled. He was manipulated. He was confused. This isn't what he wanted. Kimball looked at him directly. Mr. Crawford, your father was mentally competent when he executed this will. Dr. Reeves provided documentation of his capacity. I personally observed his decision-making process. He was not confused. He was angry at your behavior and disappointed in your manipulation. The will stands. Ashley had gone pale. She whispered something to Ethan that I couldn't hear. Ethan stood, his hands flat on the table. This is bullshit. I'll contest this. I'll prove he wasn't in his right mind. Kimball's voice hardened. You're certainly entitled to contest the will, Mr. Crawford. However, I should inform you that your father anticipated that possibility. He left a video recording explaining his decisions in his own words. That recording will be submitted as evidence if you choose to contest. Additionally, the pattern of behavior documented by Dr. Reeves, Gerald Hoffman, and other witnesses will be presented to the court. I strongly advise you to consider whether a public trial exposing your manipulation of your dying father is really the outcome you want. Ethan stood frozen, visibly calculating. Finally, he grabbed his jacket and headed for the door. This isn't over, he said, but his voice had lost its confidence. Ashley followed him, not looking back. After they left, I sat in the quiet conference room staring at Dad's letter, reading it again and again. Kimball cleared his throat gently. Your father was a good man who found himself in an impossible situation. He wanted you to know he understood what Ethan did, and he wanted to make it right the only way he could. I looked up at Kimball. Did he ever see the video I submitted to the court? The one where I testified about trying to reach him? Kimball nodded. He did. The court sent him a copy as part of the guardianship proceedings. He watched it and cried. He told me he wished he'd been strong enough to stand up to Ethan earlier, but by the time he fully understood what was happening, he was too weak to fight. The will was his way of fighting back. I left Kimball's office with a folder containing the will, Dad's letter, and documentation of my inheritance. The house at 2847 Riverside Drive, the Fidelity investment account worth $380,000, the 2019 Subaru Outback, Dad's life insurance policy worth $145,000, personal belongings, photographs, his wedding ring, his teaching awards, everything that told the story of his life, left to me because he'd known the truth even when he couldn't speak it. Ethan never filed to contest the will. Maybe he realized a public trial would expose his manipulation. Maybe Ashley talked him out of it. Maybe his attorney told him he'd lose. I'll never know because he cut off all contact. The house sale closed 3 months later for $695,000. I kept some of Dad's belongings, things that mattered, his wedding ring, photographs from his teaching career, the letters Mom had written him when they were dating. The fishing lures I donated to a youth program at the church. Let some kid who actually loved fishing inherit them. I used part of the inheritance to pay off my student loans and mortgage. The rest I put into investments and a fund for any future kids I might have. The money felt like both a gift and a burden, Dad's final attempt to make things right. 6 months after Dad's death, Gerald called to check on me. We talked for an hour about Dad, about the will, about Ethan's manipulation. Gerald mentioned he'd run into Ethan at a grocery store and Ethan had looked right through him. Your brother is still bitter, Gerald said. He tells anyone who will listen that you manipulated your father and stole his inheritance. Most people who knew your father don't believe him, but he's convinced himself of his own story. I thought about that a lot. Ethan had rewritten history in his own mind, made himself the victim, and me, the villain. He'd never acknowledge what he'd done, or feel genuine remorse. Some people can't face their own cruelty. A year after Dad's death, I drove past 2847 Riverside Drive, sold now to a young family with 2 kids. The new owners had painted the shutters blue and planted flowers in the beds Dad used to maintain. The house looked loved and lived in. I didn't stop. Some chapters need to close completely. I think about Dad often, about the letter he wrote knowing he was dying, making sure I understood he'd known the truth. That letter sits in a safe deposit box now, along with his wedding ring and the documentation Kimball provided. Physical evidence that my father loved me even when my brother tried to convince us both otherwise. Ethan stole a year from both of us, manipulated a dying man, and tried to rewrite our history. He thought he'd positioned himself perfectly to inherit everything by playing the devoted son. Instead, Dad saw through him, documented his manipulation, and made sure the truth came out in the end. That's the justice Dad delivered from beyond the grave, not just the inheritance, but the proof that he'd known all along. Ethan wanted to be the favored son. Instead, he became the son who got 23, fishing lures, and the permanent knowledge that his father had seen his cruelty and rejected him for it. Sometimes I wonder if Ethan understands the real cost of what he did. He didn't just lose an inheritance. He lost his father's respect, his family's trust, and any chance of redemption. He destroyed relationships that could never be rebuilt over money and control. That's a far worse legacy than anything Dad could have written in a will. I carry my father's letter in my wallet now, folded carefully in the billfold. On hard days, I pull it out and read the parts where he says he loved me, where he explains he saw through Ethan's manipulation, where he apologizes for not being strong enough to fight. Those words matter more than the house or the money or any material inheritance. They're proof that love survived even when someone tried to kill it with lies. That's what I inherited that really mattered. Not the estate, the truth. Dad made sure I knew I hadn't been abandoned or forgotten. I'd been stolen from, but I'd been loved. He made sure Ethan knew he'd been seen and judged and found wanting. That knowledge will live with my brother forever, far more valuable than any inheritance he might have received. In the end, Dad gave us both exactly what we deserved. I got his love and his legacy. Ethan got fishing lures and the permanent understanding that he'd been seen for who he really was. Sometimes, justice takes a year to arrive. Sometimes it comes in a letter written by a dying man who wanted to make sure the truth outlived the lies. Sometimes the person who thinks they've won discovers they've lost everything that actually mattered. My brother excluded me from our father's final year. My father made sure I got the final word. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.